Welcome back to my disembodied voice. For as long as humanity has written about its existential existence and considered the realms of this life and the next, there has been one constant in so many different books, be they religious or simply overlaid musings on the contemplations of human existence and the afterlife, and that ongoing constant is hell. The underworld of the afterlife, ruled by the Dark Lord Satan, hell has also been an image which has been burned into the annals of celluloid and been used in movies as a figurative inspiration for depicting the brutality, hopelessness, bleakness, and torment of the world around us and the human condition itself. However, hell can be different things for different people, and when I was growing up, I had a t-shirt emblazoned with a quote by the French existentialist philosopher and playwright Jean-Paul Sartre, which was adopted by the Manic Street Preachers and simply read, "Hell is other people." And the other day, whilst watching the ever-wonderful Mark Kermode review the Backrooms movie, his co-presenter, Simon Mayo, read an email from someone who had written in saying, "For me, Backrooms are hell because it isn't fire and brimstone, it's an endless space of nothingness, populated by sparse, slanted furniture, going on forever, an empty bureaucracy of vacuous nothingness that is forever there and you are trapped in it forever." And this viewer's email went on to speak about this sterile purgatory of stale bureaucracy that held an infinite space of nothingness, and said, at the end of the day, that is my definition of the worst place to be trapped in for all eternity. So, hell is subjective and completely open to interpretation, and no matter the comedy show or horror film, if anything is set in hell in the movies, there's a strong chance there's been a unique take, but at the same time, it contains the same connotative essence of hell, which is suffering, misery, hopelessness, and a place you definitely don't want to spend eternity in. Now, of course, eternity is a hard concept for the human mind, as it stretches into concepts of thought which are both challenging to form and generalised to our general acceptance, but we cannot really truly comprehend what forever is, so therefore hell has been interpreted in movies in many different ways and formats, which show different layers of suffering, different methods of psychological and physical torment, different aspects of infinity and eternity, which are more condensed to an understandable remit. So, for today's video, let's look at 3 different types of hell and see how cinema and TV has covered everything from the literal depiction of the netherworld to using the boundaries of our imagination to substitute real life hell for the hell we live through, and also putting the human psyche through its absolute most terrible moments imaginable. So we have hell in many different formats, and we're going to get into them in depth. So, first things first, let me climb the crow's nest and shout spoilers ahoy for any movie or TV show we talk about today, and then, without further ado, get to our flow through chart and look at our topics, which are literal hell, metaphorical hell, a world gone to hell. Right then, let's crack on. Now, hell has no official documented photo or video evidence which can be put down because it very much remains a concept of human imagination, theocracy, and fantasy from literary works and concepts based from the earliest musings of human development, which were documented in these developmental stages of human evolution. However, hell does have characteristics which are considered both axiomatic and connotative, and that is fire, suffering, a devil-like creature, and a place where bad people go after they die to suffer unimaginably in agony, be it from the Bible, Greek folklore, Norse mythology, literary works like Dante's Inferno, ancient Middle Eastern scriptures, or even more modern musings. If someone says to you, describe what hell looks like, then you would add your own interpretation, but as a philosophical or abstract concept, what you have read and seen about hell would affect your interpretation regardless of what you come out with, and despite the ingrained ideals about suffering, torment, and eternity in place with no reprieve from suffering, everything we lay onto that and interpret through our own subjective viewpoint stems from what we have been told about in our early years or read about in later life. Like I said before, it's connotative, which means although you may have a completely different take, like backrooms being a sense of sterile purgatory forever, the idea of suffering, the idea of infinity, the idea of this netherworld all stems from an initial concept put into our minds from books or films. So let's start at the best place to start, and that is, well, the start, and let's talk about hell in its purest form, which is literal hell, the underworld and netherworld of the afterlife, the deepest, darkest, and most awful place you spend eternity trapped within whilst suffering in torment. It's where devils and demons roam, and the versions on screen all stem from historical sources, theocracy, and vivid mythology. Now, movies covering hell have come in many forms and genres. Comedy is one, and South Park, bigger, longer, and uncut, set their story between the fictional town of South Park and the underworld. Or maybe Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, which also dealt with a version of hell. Even the low-budget British revenge movie Bull dealt with someone coming back from hell to right some wrongs, and thrillers like Jacob's Ladder deal with the precipice of hell in terms of the afterlife. However, hell feels most at home when it's in the horror genre, and for today's video, our trip into hell is with the aptly titled Hellbound, Hellraiser 2, where we leave this land of the living and head into the underworld that the Cenobites call home. Now, it's worth noting that Hellraiser's budget was tiny, and this complicated any hopes of showing a comprehensive void of eternal hellfire and rivers of flaming oil which has forever trapped souls, but what they did show was certainly bleak, vast, existential, and scrungily gnarly in terms of gore. The film presents hell as a shifting labyrinth of suffering governed by an abstract and giant crystal-shaped godlike figure of Leviathan. This representation of hell is significant because it imagines hell less as a place of straightforward punishment and more as a distorted dimension shaped by fear, pain, and psychic disorientation. We are firmly in the psychological and existential domain here, despite being in the realm of hell, so in doing so, the film can explore psychological interpretations that understand hell as an internal or experiential condition rather than just a literal destination. Villain from the first film, Frank, for example, returns, and he has been entombed in an area where he has to sit beside groaning bodies of women he can't touch. It's all very sexual. It's frustration because Frank was obsessed and addicted to sex in the real world, so he's placed into a room where all he sees are these writhing sexual bodies that appear to have perfect breasts and legs, but he can't ever touch or indulge his fantasy with. So this is Frank's personal hell, a realm of sexual frustration. Now, Clive Barker, the writer of The Hellbound Heart, which was adapted into the movie Hellraiser, was heavily into S&M and had his own fascination with BDSM and other sexual proclivities, and the film emphasises this unstable boundary between pleasure and pain, which is a theme wider to the entire Hellraiser mythology. In Hellbound, the ambiguity of the underworld and its limited budget makes its vision of hell incredibly compelling in psychological terms, as suffering is not only inflicted externally by fire, chains, and sort of BDSM pleasure-seeking demons, but it's experienced as a condition that entangles desire, punishment, bodily horror, and loss of control. Hell in this is a dark labyrinth, and we are asked to use our imaginations to fill in the blanks of vastness we don't explore, because when we are given a perspective of hell through the eyes of Kirsty Cotton, Frank and the other characters, instead we see a personal hell sequestered and compartmentalised inside a small quarter of this underworld. And I think this works because the generic version of hell is very red, fire, brimstone, and a giant satanic devil emerging from a pit of molten rock. But as I stated at the start, with how a viewer interpreted Backrooms, hell would be an infinite and indescribable place of concepts not conceivable to humankind. So, in a more digestible reality for our brains, and in terms of Hellbound, which also has budgetary concerns, hell becomes something else. In the metaphor of Backrooms, it's an empty space of nothingness tinged with a bureaucratic sterility, which is both alienating and unnerving. But in Hellbound, it's a little bit more confined spaces within an expansive labyrinth that goes on forever, so we still have infinity, but these rooms and blocks and areas are filled with hooks and painful instruments, so we keep the connotations of pain, but we also add the psychological tenets of suffering and existential torment alongside that. But when we move away from this literal hell, we come to a different type of movie, one which still uses classical depictions from things like the Bible and books like Dante's Inferno, but keeps everything set in the real world with no supernatural themes, but introduces us to a true existential and psychological form of hell in the corporeal real world, our mortal life. And this place is called Metaphorical Hell. This is a city, a prison, school, or anywhere in the real world which becomes a substitute for the underworld. And the more we traverse these fictional worlds with our protagonists, the more we see a version of human suffering which is analogous to the hypothesized existence of hell. Now, psychological interpretations of a real world as a metaphor for hell do not treat it simply as a literal place of infernal punishment, but as a symbolic comparison for extreme mental, emotional, existential, and at times physical suffering. In this view, hell refers to states in which the self feels trapped in torture and hardship, but also sees guilt, shame, trauma, alienation, dread, or inner fragmentation break apart the soul as the person tries to exist in a world of pain and broken fragments. This hell is highlighted by social conditions such as poverty, desperation, and systemic hardship, when human life becomes marked by hopelessness and real, horrible dehumanization. And rather than emphasizing external or eternal punishment, this approach focuses on how suffering becomes internalized and experienced as an ongoing condition of mind which works in tandem and is tidally locked to the desperation, hardship, and suffering of the reality which surrounds our protagonists. And this shift from the afterlife to a lived experience allows religious imagery to be read as symbolic language for emotional and existential pain, alongside the hopelessness and guilt which imbues the darkening worlds of the fictional hell. And movies about imprisonment, separation, hopelessness, and also mass impoverishment remain so powerful that they closely resemble and echo our own fears and realities of depression, unresolved trauma, chronic shame, and the collapse of meaning into a form of hell itself, which makes these particular movies so great. And two such movies we will cover today, heavily influenced by and metaphorically symbolic of Dante's Inferno, are the psychological thriller Seven and the Vince Vaughn challenging to watch but ultimately compelling ultra-violent Brawl in Cell Block 99. Brawl in Cell Block 99 is a movie best interpreted through a Dantean lens. At the start of the movie, Vince Vaughn is laid off from his job and he goes home to find his partner has been cheating on him. So, after imitating the bonus car smashing scene in Street Fighter 2, he and his partner vow to change and build a proper life together. When we next catch up with them, she is pregnant and he is successfully navigating a life of crime but gets mixed up with someone new and does a drug retrieval which goes horribly wrong. Vince Vaughn then does the decent thing in a bad situation and stops the bad guys from just mindlessly killing cops, but this begins his descent both literally and figuratively into hell. Vince Vaughn's character then begins to move through increasingly brutal and dehumanising prisons which are metaphorical to a modern descent into Dante's Inferno. Okay, so there are no 9 literal circles he goes through, but after being moved from his original prison to the Red Leaf maximum security, he starts in a room with a blocked toilet, my own personal hell if I'm being honest, no loo, and then descends this secular version of hell as he goes right to the bottom, the basement, the furthest layer of the prison where there is only punishment, grime, bodily torment, and immoral extremity. This makes Brawl in Cell Block 99 especially relevant to psychological interpretations of hell because its horror lies not in the supernatural fire, but in the crushing experiences of confinement, dehumanisation, and hopelessness as Vince Vaughn realises he hasn't been sent there to kill Christopher Bridges. He's there to be tormented by men looking to forever trap him inside the bottom layer, which in Dante's Inferno was filled with ice, but here it's broken glass which covers the entire floor, and he will spend the rest of his life in a room with a floor of broken glass, a hole to crap into, and a bed which is so uncomfortable it hurts to lie on. In this sense, the film reimagines Dante's infernal journey in modern terms, presenting hell as an environment of total suffering that is once physical, moral, and existential. From a psychological viewpoint, Vince Vaughn is in hell here because he will never leave no matter what he does or whatever altruistic methods he tries to appease the guards. He can obey, beg, he can even try to fight back, but the rest of his days will be spent in a cell of broken glass and the toilet hole, rotting without ever seeing daylight or feeling hope again. Now, whilst Vince Vaughn starts the film in daylight, from when he loses his job, and then goes to the blue-hued prison, when he first gets arrested, and then into the dark red-tinted bowels of the Red Leaf maximum security, the director uses colour to great effect to mirror the descent from the upper world into the underworld. And another director who uses colour to great effect in his film is David Fincher in Seven, which is merely wet, grey, dark, raining, and just generally miserable to look at. Set in a nameless city which is soaked by rain all the time, the movie Seven oozes poverty and the fading shades of humanity. This city has people in it, but most are just hollow wraiths who move between streets, alleyways, gutters, and the overpopulated tower blocks filled with antisocial behaviour and alienation. And Seven holds Jungian archetypes, which is where Carl Jung viewed hell as a projection of the shadow, the repressed, dark, and unacknowledged parts of the human psyche, and every single person in this film, aside from the 2 main protagonists and maybe 1 or 2 others, is just a form, a shade, a shadow of what used to be a human being, and it truly is an endless sea of concrete and misery. In Seven, hell is not merely punishment, but the suffering that follows from radical self-division and self-atomization. The more one denies unwanted aspects of the self, the more compulsively they may surface in anxiety, rage, envy, or self-sabotaging behaviour. After all, the film is about the 7 sins, and Mills himself undoes his own life in one moment of wrathful revenge, And this purgatorial city of hell, which the movie is set in, is filled with anger, loss, and strangers who just don't talk to each other or are just genuinely unpleasant. The city also has extremes of existential dread and isolation. Now, from an existential view, hell is the agony of isolation, meaningless, and the burden of radical freedom without purpose. More broadly, existential psychology understands hell as the collapse of meaning, a state in which a person confronts freedom, mortality, and responsibility without any stable framework to orientate to natural life and meaning. Everyone in Seven, all the denizens in the city, are lost. The gluttony victim is a shut-in. The sloth victim is a cipher of society and peddling in rather unpleasant crime. And even when Detective Mills chases John Doe through the tower block, across the rooftops and through the street, nobody is really concerned. They just hurl insights and treat this life or death pursuit as an annoying inconvenience of noise and disruption amongst the everyday traffic of monotony. Now, theological psychologists interpret hell as a state of supreme psychological separation. It is the ultimate consequence of chronic self-isolation, narcissism, refusal of relationships, or estrangement from any higher source of meaning, and John Doe even points to this theory in his soliloquy at the end of the movie. Doe sees a world gone to hell, full of sin, selfishness, and pointlessness. He sees no hope. He sees apathy everywhere. He sees everything as broken and the complete breakdown of virtue and humanity, and everything is lost. For Doe, he is living inside his own personal hell, which is this city of extreme poverty and dehumanization. And psychologically, the people in Seven are all victims of a life organised around disconnection, an existence cut off and forever lost in this bustling nightmare of alienation, anger, self-atomization, and struggling to find an existential reason to live harmoniously and happily. And two characters especially lost in this existential hell and literal purgatory of eternal rain are Morgan Freeman's Detective Somerset and vagina candle-making Gwyneth Paltrow. They both hate this city and see it for what it is, a horrible place with horrible conditions and no hope. Brad Pitt's Detective Mills is a little more optimistic and idealistic, and as he even said, he hopes to do some good. But deep down, he's just as existentially lost as the others and has far too much anger and narcissism, and, like the souls in Dante's Inferno, he is trapped, sinking and forever interred to this sludge of a purgatory. And the rain, which falls all the time, could also be metaphorical of Dante's lust circle of hell, which has constant tempests, rain and hurricanes, and lacking all the control and normality of the corporeal real world. The sinners in Inferno were forever to be tossed and thrown about and never finding peace in the supersonic storm of the lust circle, and in Seven, as the rain falls and the sinners go about their daily lives of envy, wrath, lust, gluttony, and so forth, the high-rise hell around them is just the cesspool they are destined to rot in. From a psychological point, hell is reframed as a symbolic description of suffering rather than as a final verdict on a person's worth. Depression, anxiety, trauma responses, self-atomization through vices of drugs and alcohol, and cycles of shame by using sins as escapism from the horrors of the real world means that we're not in fiery hell here, but existentially lost and buried beneath economic weights and existential struggles. So, in the movies Seven and Brawl in Cell Block 99, psychological interpretations transform hell from a static destination into a human experience that can be confronted and endured, but for both Detective David Mills and Vince Vaughn, one that will claim their lives in one way or another at the end of the day. Okay, so we've done literal hell and metaphorical hell, so let's come to a world gone to hell. An apocalypse has caused a total breakdown of social order via a catastrophic event, and this has fundamentally ended what we perceive as normal society, and, in its place, there is nothing but a wasteland of violence and instability. Be it The Walking Dead or HBO's The Last of Us, once the zombie apocalypse hits, the entire world effectively goes to hell. And this post-apocalyptic setting is not only terrifying because of the undead or fungus-infected people, but because civilization itself has collapsed into fear, scarcity, violence, and a constant sense of insecurity. Now, in psychological terms, this environment resembles hell as a condition of collective trauma and repeated dehumanization. People live in a state of constant fight or flight. Communities form in scattered pockets but are very insular and scared of the outside world. And circles of people are made where laws are defined by leaders and moral boundaries slowly begin to erode. And on top of that, human relationships become shaped by grief, paranoia, and brutality rather than love and cherishing. In The Walking Dead, the real horror does not lie solely with the fear of being eaten and then turned into a zombie, but in what prolonged terror does to the living and how the living can become despotic and tyrannical in their view of the world and their entire functioning. In the comics, Rick Grimes even says, "We are the Walking Dead," as his group pontificates on the hopelessness of their existence. So, in The Walking Dead, with communities repeatedly fracturing under pressure, violence erupting, and individuals struggling to preserve their individual humanity, we see a world not simply as a place of hellish punishment, but as a total societal condition, which means safety and moral order have broken down, and we are now living in a state of something that can't be fixed. This is now what the world is and will go on, presumably for eternity, as small pockets of society may rebuild their individual worlds, but they're not going to put the whole world back together into what it once was. And right from the start of Rick Grimes' coma waking moments, we go through stages of a society being rebuilt, collapsing and rebuilt, as we encourage the failed experiments of the early towns like Woodbury and the Governor, to the Prisoner, which soon becomes a prison to its people, to the suburban and farming attempts like Alexandria and Hilltop, before we meet the Saviours and their form of tax and checks and balances, of giving half just so you don't get killed, before we devolve back into something more carnal and nomadic with the Whisperers, before we finally see a city being erected in the Commonwealth. However, with consequences and law gone, the most dangerous thing remains the humans, and that remains the same in each of the places. The Governor is the most dangerous person in Woodbury. Negan is the most dangerous person in the Sanctuary. And yes, the undead remain a risk, but all they're going to do is bite and kill you. The living, they will ransack, beat, sexually assault, ruin, subjugate, humiliate, steal your resources, and in some case use your resources for themselves, leaving you with nothing, and in the worst case, as in the termites, use you as a resource of food because they will eat you. Hell in The Walking Dead is painted in circles, but not descending circles, but social circles, where we have just a few people, like the Claimers, or maybe a massive community like the Sanctuary or the Whisperers, and see how they have found their own ethos into how living in this world, which doesn't really have an identity anymore, so you're kind of rebuilding that world in your own subjective identity and viewpoint of what the world should be. Now, for many people, that's very nice and very civil, and a society where people have rules and laws and we trade. But for others, it's simply an excuse to go and purge, steal, ransack, create chaos, and take for themselves by any means necessary. In The Walking Dead, hell is also vast open spaces, populated by the dead roaming endlessly, but with pockets of civilization fighting desperately for resources and hoping to find a rare truck full of toothpaste or maybe a few bottles of whiskey. And whilst people fight for food, companionship and try to form codes of trust, we come back to the connotations we said at the start of metaphorical hell, which is alienation, isolation, existential breakdowns, and the stress of living in a state of constant fight or flight and experiencing recurring grief from loved ones dying or people being killed by other people, and the most base corruption of human egoism, narcissism, and the depths someone will go to in order to survive. Here, hell is a condition of the psyche. It is a vision of the world, and it is also something that can be recognised, interpreted, and potentially transformed into an individual's own personal circle of either paradise or torture. The Walking Dead presents one long wasteland of nothingness, the dead, and it is only broken by the depravity of survival by the strongest groups amid this land of sin, where the worst of humanity succeeds, and people are forever trapped in an inescapable void of torment. Anyway, that's it for this week's video. So remember that psychology is cool.
So cool.
Please like, share and subscribe, as more subs means more vids, and even leave a comment or start a discussion, as healthy debate is always welcome on here. And as ever, until next time, I'll catch you later.